a man who's been so important in singularity studies and in the science fiction community. My name is Bob Pisani. I am a stock market reporter, the stock market reporter for CNBC. And if you're wondering what the heck am I doing here, I've had a long-standing interest in accelerating change going back all the way to the summer of 1966 when, as an eager 10-year-old, I put a 10 cent in a little paper envelope and mailed it to the Science Fiction Book Club and got my first science fiction collection, Arthur C. Clarke. And coincidentally, summer of '66 was the summer that this man published his first science fiction story, Bookworm Run, which you can still read with profit today. It's about intelligence amplification, a subject which we're very interested in, all of us here, and which he has still been very much preoccupied with over the years. Vernor Vinge has won 3 Hugo Awards for Best Novel, and that is quite a feat, and you don't have to know much about science fiction, I will tell you that is quite a feat. Most recently in 2007 for Rainbow's End, and I'm often asked about novels of the singularity. Rainbow's End is a particularly fine novel of what we call the near singularity, that is people who are just on the cusp of a singularity. It occurs in about 2025. And I highly recommend it to you. Other books that people ask me about I think are very interesting on the singularity is Accelerando by Charles Stross, which is concerned with not just the near future, but also going to the far future. It's actually a collection of short stories. I want to begin, Vernor, by asking you about the current financial crisis. I think none of us can sit in this room and act like what's going on outside the world doesn't matter, because we are having a potentially historic event occur. And I want to ask about how this might relate to the things that are of interest to this particular group. So we all know about the proximate causes of the current financial crisis. We know about too much debt in the world. We know about too much leverage. We know about lax regulation as another potential cause of it. But I want you to address what I think is a tangential relationship with accelerating change. And that is that one of the principles of accelerating change is that it tends to increase uncertainty, not decrease uncertainty. And that accelerating changes, accelerating technologies tend to make the probability curve, tends to drive the outcomes to the far end of the probability curves. That is, uncertainty increases. Address that principle of accelerating change and how it relates to the current financial crisis.
Well, I certainly agree that it makes for a different situation, but in particular, as we all know, there are lots of things that are uncertain in the world. Weather is uncertain. But when you deal with people, things become a whole lot more uncertain because we all know about people, you know what they're like, that they interact with each other and game each other. And what we have now with the trends leading to the singularity is that we have technology that we're outsourcing our intelligence to. And so the uncertainty of dealing with planning with humans is compounded by all the different things that people are going to be doing with their toys in the next 10 or 15 years. And this makes for an extremely choppy situation, much more choppy than even the stuff that we've looked at economically in the past. So I think that actually classic trend line analysis is seriously doomed in that sort of situation. Planning is not entirely impossible, but it should be much more related to scenarios than placing one's faith in trend lines and error bars.
To a certain extent, we're seeing this now. One of the problems in the business that I cover, which is the stock market, is professional traders are having a very difficult problem pricing the stock market. Stock prices are based on some multiple of future earnings. But if your earnings outlook is completely uncertain, if they're swinging in 40% ranges like they have been in the last 6 weeks, your models tend to break down. And that's another interesting feature. You touched upon this. Part of the problem seems to be a deficiency in modeling and an inability to accurately price risk. This is another aspect of accelerating change.
Yeah, I agree. And again, using scenarios and thinking about scenarios is a way at that. And in fact, science fiction, besides being mostly pure entertainment, is a source of scenarios. If you have never looked at scenario planning and never looked at science fiction, I think both of those are worth looking at, and much of it is dismissible. But one thing about scenarios is even the scenarios that you are morally certain are not really going to materialize are worth having on your list, because that allows you to have symptom lists. And if you start seeing symptoms for scenarios that you have looked at carefully in the past, if you start seeing those symptoms, even though you may have been incredulous about the situation, you actually are primed to react more promptly than people who see the symptoms and just say that's a statistical blip.
That's why reading science fiction is so worthwhile, and I'm surprised sometimes it's how many people I know who are into robotics or into the singularity in some way haven't read science fiction. It's the difference between scenarios and versus trend analysis. It's a completely different way of looking at things, but it's equally valid as not just an art form, as entertainment, as you said, but as a way of looking at the future. For example, you have been dealing with the singularity for almost 30 years in science fiction themes and have thought out, you and your colleagues, multiple scenarios that could be of great benefit to anyone who's looking at this. And if you're not aware of it, you're missing another potential worldview that can help change the way you think of things. I know it's changed the way I think of things, reading science fiction, not just as entertainment.
Even if a person is quite convinced the singularity is going to happen, there are 3 or 4 radically different ways that it could happen that have entirely different flavors and in some ways entirely different symptom sets.
We want to talk a little bit, I want you to just touch for 1 minute on the point you made earlier. To what extent are we essentially now outsourcing creativity and intellect? We're doing this to a certain extent in the stock market, where computer models now do a lot of the trading. They are programmed by humans and to a certain extent can be halted by humans, but a lot of trading now occurs in a programmed mode.
Yeah, I think that humans have been characterized as the tool-making creature, but that really isn't the best characterization. The best characterization I know that distinguishes humans is that we are the creatures that outsource our intellect into our environment and into our artifacts. Reading and writing is outsourcing of memory. And what we're going through now is outsourcing of bigger and bigger hunks of our cognition. And so as we go forward into this next decade, one of the most interesting things to track is the amount of that goes on, how successful it is, what sort of problems it causes, and how it shrinks what it is reasonable to pay a human to do. And I think we can already see that it's quite uncomfortable in some cases. There is still a reason for us to be there and doing things, but it is a more narrowly and narrowly defined issue of judgment and common sense that still remains unoutsourced.
Good point. Your 1993 essay that you gave at Nassau, The Coming Technological Singularity, and those of you who haven't seen this, I think it is fair to say, and I know you're a modest man, but I think it's fair to say that in decades to come, this will be one of the ore texts of the singularity. It is one of the most commonly cited texts, and in it, you talked about signs and wonders, coming signs of the singularity, different scenarios and how to look at it. I want to run through 3 or 4 scenarios and get a little bit of an update since then, and I know you've talked about it several times. The hardware versus software problem. Let me read a sentence of what you said in 1993. Until we have hardware as powerful as the human brain, it is probably foolish to think we'll be able to create a human equivalent or greater intelligence. How short is the computer hardware so far from the computational power of the human brain? Are we anywhere close?
I pretty much agree with people like Hans Moravec and Ray Kurzweil that we are getting into the general area where first the largest and most expensive computers that can't get funding to concentrate on this might be that powerful if you could organize them properly. So I think we're moving into that era in the next decade, and beyond that, as that quality of computer becomes cheaper, and you can get a lot of research programs funded that actually can have dedicated machines, that there would be stuff that you could see. At the same time, some of these other scenarios do not really depend on specifically that development of super large machines, and depend more on other sorts of applications, and including small and distributed systems.
You have stuck by your prediction. This is his 1993 prediction that a singularity was likely before 2030. Why are you still sticking with that prediction?
Partly because Moore's law is held up, which gives us this plausibility argument that we just talked about. and partly by watching what is going on. The major symptoms, I think, are still following along. Some of the particular scenarios are going like gangbusters. The next talk here this morning is Nova Spivak, who is talking about a scenario that often eludes the pure AI people, the scenario of humanity as a whole, plus their databases and networks and their communication systems. That ensemble could be something that is arguably of superhuman intelligence. I'm very interested to see what Nova is going to be saying specifically about that.
You taught computer science for a long time. How about the software end of this? Is there any signs of limits to applicational complexity at this point?
I think the sneering skeptics
have
have their strongest position when they say, "Oh yeah, they can have any hardware you want," but you are clueless about how to put it together. And I think that getting the stuff put together properly is the biggest uncertainty. And watching what those people do in that research is very, very interesting. And there's research there at various levels. There's research where you're basically doing very low level. You can't tell whether they're studying minds, using the computers to study the minds, real minds, or using the real minds to study how to make humanly smart computers. That's going forward, but so is larger sorts of organizational studies. And so is very broadly human-computer interface work. I would say there are probably hundreds of thousands of people working on this stuff that may never even think that they're working on creating the singularity. In fact, that's one of the most powerful reasons why the whole argument is plausible. It is that unlike other things we might like to have happen, like the space program or certain medical things, that here you have something where a very large number of people in almost every endeavor are working, because there's an economic plus that is rewarded incrementally. The payoff is very fast for any advances along any of these dimensions. So it's one of those things that really has an enormous pressure behind it, whether or not there's any overall long-term vision behind it.
I want to talk about intelligence amplification, and I want to highly recommend to the audience Vernor's very first short story. I know you're particularly proud of it because you've talked to me about it for many times. It's called Bookworm Run. It was published in Analog in 1966, but it's in the collected stories of Vernor Vinge. In fact, that's the first story there, and it's about intelligence amplification of exactly the sort that we are talking about now. It involves a chimpanzee that actually escapes from a top secret unit where they are studying intelligence amplification and brain-computer interfaces. Talk to us briefly about where you think that activity is and how much profit we might have from neural computer interfaces.
The general idea, I think, has been put best by the science fiction writer David Brin, who wrote an essay, who has made the point that it is not necessarily that you have wires stuck into your head, but that imagining the computer that you deal with not so much as being like a BlackBerry or a G1 as being like a neocortex. And this is actually especially attractive to people who are otherwise uneasy about the notion of superintelligence, because the neocortex provides the intellectual horsepower, and we humans provide what we are best at, as David says, the get up and go and wanting. We humans are very good at wanting. And so the team of the human and the neocortex is superhuman, but it's still the human in the saddle. So people who are especially enthusiastic about intelligence amplification, many of them don't even regard that we're headed for a singularity. I remember Hans Moravec many years ago, early 80s, when I first started talking about this, this word anyway, he said, I agree with essentially everything you're saying, Vernor, but it's not going to be a singularity if you're riding the curve. And he says, I intend to ride that curve, presumably with something like intelligence amplification.
There was a very interesting comment made yesterday. James Cassio spoke at the conference yesterday and made a very interesting point about the potential banality of the singularity. And even he was making a broader point about the banality of technology in general. And that is that absent a Terminator-type scenario, that the singularity may occur in a way that is actually quite banal, that it would occur in a way where it's very normal. And because it occurs so incrementally, suddenly machine intelligence is basically running things and nobody is particularly freaking out about it. Is that banality when it comes to technology, because we're so used to talking about the wonders of technology, I think is an interesting way to turn the idea on its head a little bit.
I think Gervais is absolutely right about banality and technology up to the singularity. In fact, that's one of the essential stylistic discoveries of 20th century science fiction, most famously shown by Robert Heinlein's stories. But I think that in the case of the singularity, if you are the guy riding the curve, if you are becoming superhumanly intelligent, then yes, the banality argument fits fine. However, anybody after the singularity who is of our intelligence, I think, would be in a situation where banality might come up, but it's a different sort of situation, because we are no longer in the driver's seat. We are no longer understanding what is going. We're no longer so easy to fool ourselves into thinking we understand what is going on.
Intelligence amplification is an amazing area. If you think about it, it's incredible how intelligent a human being in front of a connected computer is, and how smart they can be, and how many questions they can. I'm a reporter. I get calls all over the place from people asking obscure questions about the stock market, and with the databases I have, it's amazing how smart I sound on the phone. It's absolutely incredible. And I often thought we could do a reverse Turing test. That is, could I convince a machine that I was an artificial intelligence if I was connected enough to do it? And that was almost the point of intelligence amplification in a way. I want to talk a little bit about biomedical enhancement. Anti-aging is sort of all the rage these days. So we all have our doctors we go to, and we have blood tests up the yin-yang, and we're taking all sorts of pills, and we're exercising a lot more. I wonder if we can just turn this on its head. One person I was talking to about this once said, you know, Bob, suppose you're right. Suppose you could demonstrate by something you were doing, some pills or exercise or blood tests or something you were doing, that your intelligence went up 10%. Versus the singularity, is that going to matter that much? How much more would it really matter when you're actually dealing with that kind of level of intelligence?
I think one thing to be very wary of is things that are claimed to be intelligence-enhancing drugs that are really just alertness-enhancing or keep you awake or things like that. In fact, if you look at the history of drug problems, that's been the sort of a thing that's been bragged about a lot of things, including probably repeatedly amphetamines. On the other hand, I think it is quite likely that we will get biomedical intelligence enhancement, and in my opinion, that and even genetic enhancement does not scale with the same flexibility and potential that moving to the different substrate of present day semiconductors and things like that. However, that doesn't mean that it is still very appropriate to pursue, because anything that allows we as humans to keep up, whether it's intelligence amplification or biomedical enhancement, that allows us to keep up intellectually, is something that allows us to have a hand, at least some hand on the tiller. It will be a hand that's submerged in all the cross currents of the stuff that is going on. But I think actually the longer that there is a human influence, the better for life as a whole in the future.
By the way, I don't share that cynicism about the 10% increase wouldn't matter. I very much want a 10% increase, but it is an interesting perspective to have when you're dealing with potential superintelligence.
Actually, I agree. It is very important. I'm just saying, you're not going to get 10,000%. You're not going to get 1,000,000%. It fades in comparison to what the competition can deliver.
One of my favorite novels of yours, my favorite novel of yours, is Of a Fire Upon the Deep. He won the Hugo Award for this in 1993. And one of your principles is always don't try to understand what a singularity type intelligence would be like because it's hopeless on the other side. But that hasn't prevented you from playing around
I speculate all the time.
on the edges of it. And in Of a Fire Upon the Deep, those of you who don't know this, it's many, 5 billion years into the future, talk about far future. And there are the Milky Way galaxy is divided into zones of thought where extremely superhuman intelligences can reside, called the powers. And there are still humans, but there are also other intelligences, of course. And there's a very ancient power, which is a superhuman intelligence, artificial intelligence, or what we would call, which has awakened because humans have found an ancient archive. One of the things that happens in this superpower that is unleashed is that it reacts in very human-like ways. Although we cannot understand it, and you don't attempt to get into its mind, it does behave in ways that are interestingly human. For example, when it sees that there is an actual threat to its existence, it throws together essentially an armada to try to stop the forces that have realized there is a vulnerability in its programming. How can we understand, now that I've set you up for an impossible question, how can we possibly understand things on the other side of the singularity? What can we do?
First of all, let me rush to say that I do not believe the universe is divided up into zones. This is my way of keeping the singularity off stage, which is actually, from the standpoint of a professional science fiction writer, one of our big problems. Is if you can't write about the future because it's unknowable, what do? Well, I made up this magic of the zones. How do you deal with thinking about superhumanly intelligent critters? One way is I think by analogy. In the case you just described, certain attributes were attributed to this critter that worked in modeling its behavior. Some of the analogies that a person can pursue is our relationship with animals. This is almost always a very scary analogy to pursue, and I'm not going to, we're not nice to animals. So, but that is one family of analogies, and probably the one that produces the most horrified fear. But other analogies are the rise of life, the Precambrian explosion. And if you look at the broad range of evolution, what we're going through now is this fact where life is actually creating faster life. And if you look at the broad spectrum of evolution, much of evolution is not nature bloody in tooth and claw. It actually is about cooperation. And a very common pattern is you get life that goes forward and enters a new area and is able to do things much more efficiently, and it becomes the infrastructure for that new life. The new life actually depends on the old life. That has sort of happened over and over again, and it's actually a pretty optimistic view of this sort of self-improvement that goes along, that does not involve really destroying what went before, but using it as the basis for being better.
I want to talk, rather than the optimistic scenarios, let's talk about potential failure scenarios. You and I have talked in the past about, it seems the one weakness here is embedded microprocessors that exist, and that if some way could be found to disable them, essentially everything sort of stops. Is this a fanciful idea? Are there failure scenarios here for the singularity?
Ah.
Not that it's technologically impossible, but
Right.
that it fails either through a deliberate or a not deliberate attempt.
A person in America nowadays is every day confronted with new existential threats. That's not what that's not what we're about here today. But there is one existential threat that is so relevant to what we're doing, and it lies smack dab on one of the trajectories into the singularity, that even though it's not the singularity itself, I think that we, especially in this place, San Jose, have a responsibility to think about. And that is, embedded, networked microprocessors are the biggest economic win of the last 50 years. And they are going like gangbusters, and they are going to continue to go like gangbusters. They may be the way the singularity actually materializes, in which reality itself wakes up. But along the way, they are such an economic win that they do become ubiquitous, and they introduce a single failure point in almost everything. And unfortunately, they are so good, and this trend is not going to be stopped, and they are so profitable that we have a tendency to ignore the fact that it's a single failure point. After all, we don't have any spectacular failures to point to. We don't know, we should know, but we don't know how many people would die if something like this actually did fail. We should think about this. There are clear failure scenarios like EMP. And there are, given that it's a single failure point, even if we don't have other obvious failure scenarios, we should be thinking about this. Not going to stop the trend, but you should be thinking about mitigating heterogeneous, greater heterogeneity in the substrate that you're using, and which are the particular failure modes, like logistical failure modes and power grid failure modes, that would be exterminating events, and put in some parallel options. So I think that is very important ongoing, and it is relevant to what a lot of people in here are doing.
Let's talk about not just the failure scenarios, but some of the, not disaster scenarios, but about Bill Joy's famous essay in Wired magazine, "The Future Doesn't Need Us," about the perils of nanotechnology and bioengineering. You're a realist, I think. You're not a pessimist, and you're not a blind optimist. Give us your particular vision of where this is all going to play out.
Well, I think that Bill Joy's essay could be right. Although if it is right, mitigating policies are not clear to me that they exist. On the other hand, it's really possible that Bill Joy has it backwards. It could be that the future needs us very, very much. Just put yourself in the shoes, I'm not supposed to be able to do this, but put yourself in the shoes of a superhuman intelligence. Looking back at humans, the superhuman intelligence says, my God, those humans, they can work and function perfectly well in the total absence of environments where any reasonable life can survive, namely myself, this superhuman silicon whatever. In a way, we are the ultimate fallback system. So this is sort of a superhuman green perspective, that we are something that can work even if technology goes away. We could bring back the important people in just a few centuries if technology went entirely away. This is the same way we depend on the natural living world around us, and it's also an example of this template that I was describing about how life moves forward, creates a situation where something much more efficient can work. That original life still has to be there because actually it's providing what's necessary for the advancements to continue to work.
We've got 2 minutes left here. You have made a point before that if the singularity can happen, it will happen. You still believe that there's a certain inevitability to the technological progress?
barring physical catastrophes. I mean, if you had a major nuclear war, if humanity became extinct, it wouldn't happen. And if we had a major nuclear war, it could postpone things for a long time. But short of something like that, if it can happen, I think it will happen.
Well, this was at the basis of Nick Bostrom's fascinating essay on extraterrestrial intelligence, and one of the reasons we may not be seeing them as much is that sufficiently advanced technologies destroy themselves. Let's hope that does not happen with the human race, obviously. And those of you who would like to meet Vernor, he'll be here all day. If you want a primer on Vernor Vinge, I put one together, a one-page sheet. I'll be happy to give it to or email it to anybody who would want it. Vernor Vinge, thank you for your efforts, and thank you for your work throughout the years. He'll be here all day, folks. Thank you. Good job. Well, it worked really well. It was terrific. You did a great job.
Can you answer 2 questions?
Certainly.
Okay.
We'll take a couple of questions.
Two questions.
Yes, sir.
All right, I want to address that in brief, there's been a lot of talk about keep the humans in the driver's seat, okay? And I would like to suggest that we have not only a limited amount of intelligence, but a particular kind of intelligence that generates war, torture, genocide, female infant mutilation, name your favorite, okay? We aren't real pleasant intelligences. And the thing that's possible with engineering an AI is to engineer one without our baggage in it, without 4 billion years of evolutionary competition in it. And even if it can't be super intelligent, if it gets to where it can talk, we ought to A, listen to it, and maybe turn the world over to it, let it be king. Because we are not doing a wonderful job. We are not the people who should have massive nuclear arsenals, and we can't give them up because of what we are.
Most people that I know are very in favor of intelligence amplification. You have just articulated an argument that a very good friend of mine believes also, and that is that we carry around so much bloody baggage that he says he would just as soon not have that be what is driving things. I am not quite as sure of you of the overall final conclusion, but I do agree that I think there are strong reasons to believe that going forward, intelligence will be nicer. And the reason is partly what you said, and partly because anytime you're playing a positive sum game, it makes sense to be nice. And I think that with greater intelligence, that playing positive sum games becomes much more plausible, and that there is a real interest and motive in supporting all sorts of modes of intelligence.
So you think that not only could we make machines that are more benevolent, but we could even change our own particular thinking? I mean, the depressing side is, the gentleman's right, the things that have motivated men and women have not changed since the days of Caesar. In fact, long before
Right.
that.
And
And much of it is negative.
There is plenty of evidence recently that some people think that evolution stopped when civilization arrived. Gross phenotypic evolution may have stopped, and in fact, health robustness may have declined. However, psychological traits, there's plenty of evidence those have radically been modified since the rise of civilization. And culturally, in the last 5 centuries, thank God, since our weapons have gotten so much more powerful, culturally, I think we've gotten much better in the last 5 centuries. So there's a lot of reason, I think, to be optimistic about the various forms of intelligence here and going forward.
We have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Do you believe that climate change will have a significant effect on the singularity?
Climate change, depending on how severe it is, and most importantly, whether it provokes a nuclear war, is one of those existential threats that I held in the background. I don't think it by itself is the most serious existential threat that we face. So I think my answer would come out as a guarded and probabilistic no.
All right. Vernor will be here all day, and Nova Spivak's coming up next. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.